Coming up, with the Brooklyn Nets effectively at the quarter point of their 2022-2023 NBA season, we take a pause to reflect on where this team is and ultimately where they can go. For all of the superstars they have on the roster, can they achieve the highest level of competition competing for an NBA title? We break it down next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and let you know today's episode is going to be brought to you by Sweatblock. If you or someone you love is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, try Sweatblock. Save 20% with promo code LOCKEDON at sweatblock.com. Also available on Amazon. And Doug, 22 games. That's about 25% of the NBA season. And we figured, why not? After a win is a win, as we always love to say on the show, over the Orlando Magic, come in and evaluate where this perfectly 500 basketball team is 22 games into the process.
Yeah, 27.5% of the way through the season. So just to clarify that, way off.
That's me.
You were off by 10%. So yeah, no, we're 11-11 plus in the point differential by 0.7. I would say it's interesting. So I think there's a lot of ways that we need to examine this, and we are going to look at this from a number of different angles, because I think this Nets team just at this point requires you to take a look at things not just through one lens. You have to look at things through many lenses. If you're like, for instance, if you're a fan of the Warriors, you look at things through one lens, championships or not, right? Like that's it. Even if you're like maybe the Celtics now, I think there's certain teams, the Bucks, there's a class of teams that are now in the championship or bust category. I think we thought the Nets were in that category. I do not think the Nets are in that category. Like I think that after 27.5% of the way through the season at 11-11, knowing all the things we know about this team, just for starters, I think we have to probably begin removing the part where we see this team as strictly championship or bust. And I think that's really just from an emotional hedging standpoint, right? Like I think that where the Nets have shown us to be, where we see them in terms of team construction, where we see them as they sort of sit in the rest of the East, and with all the question marks around the team, I do think that there has to be a new way to probably examine this, because I just can't at this point in good conscience put them among the very top group in the NBA. They just don't belong there. Look, when we get to the 44 game mark, or 41 game mark for the real halfway point, could we reevaluate this? Yeah, that's the whole point. The whole point of doing this is to examine your priors, examine your current situation, and try to make an assessment about where you are. And I think with the current construction of the team and the way things are shaking out, and there's going to be some stuff we'll throw out there to like make it so this is hammers to this point home, but they're just not a championship level team as currently constructed. I mean, do you see it the same way? I'm trying not to be negative, but I'm trying to be realistic. And by the way, you can be different versions of this, but like, do you see that the same way?
Yeah, this is you go into the eye doctor, better one lens or two, one or two, and you go, right, well, give me one right now, but in a couple of seconds, give me two, and let me kind of flesh through. Is when you mentioned looking at it through different layers of lenses here. I agree with you. This is not a championship caliber team. Like you flat out cannot look at the first 22 games and assess it any other way. I think that, in the spectrum of what it was supposed to be, that can be really disappointing. And you said emotionally hedging here. I think coming off this Orlando game and a 45-point performance from Kevin Durant, they can still be a really entertaining team. Yeah. They're still going to be a really fun team to watch. There's other versions that are not championship caliber teams that don't have a superstar or two superstars, or maybe, another high caliber player like a Ben Simmons, right? So from that standpoint, there's still a lot, I think, of fun to be taken out of this team over the rest of the season. And maybe it will look different as we move along. There's been a lot of things that have gone completely awry here, changing coaches, guys in and out of the lineups, injuries, as always play a factor here. But I do think, and this goes back in a lot of ways to our discussion in the offseason, I think for me personally was I, I had a very low level, and I've waffled in some of the games they've had this season. I was very close to saying they should be considering blowing it up because they're not going to be competing for a championship. 27.5% of the way through the season, that's been confirmed for me. This is not a championship level team. That can be okay, but you're not a part of the upper echelon here. And as you said, those higher level teams, there's a lot of stats and just the eye test that tells you why there's a clear divide from where the Brooklyn Nets are and where those teams are.
So one good way to evaluate this, just to start, is to look at betting markets and to see where, where money stands. Now, I will say championship markets are not super liquid, so they won't. I think they're like a decent reflection of where a team stands, and we know that these markets are weird, are weird to adjust because one, it's like super hard to get a lot of money in on this kind of thing for starters, and two, actually that is just two. Like, it's just going to be hard to, they're not going to move all that much short of like major injuries around a player. Like, right. Someone, Giannis lost for the season, something like that, then the Bucks would drop precipitously. Like, other than that, there's not going to be small fluctuations. I will say though, there are beginning to be stirrings here where the Nets have been traditionally overvalued by markets. I mean, they're one of the worst against the spread teams over the last 2 seasons. It's a game in, game out thing where they're heavily favored. They can't put teams away. Like, we've seen this happen over and over, right? Or they just lose games to lesser teams where they're favored. Yep. So against the spread, just traditionally, Vegas and betting markets have had a really hard time with it. Now, that being said, our friends over at Bet Online right now actually have the Nets at I had this right away they're 9th overall in championship odds. That is considerably lower actually than some other houses out there. Above the Nets right now, Celtics, Bucks, Warriors, Suns, Clippers, Cavs, Grizzlies, Sixers, and then the Nets, who are tied with the Nuggets for 9th. That is the lowest I've seen them anywhere over basically the last 2 years. And this included going into the playoffs last year, where they were a complete question mark. I think they were higher last year when they were down 3-0 to the Celtics or something like that. This is the kind of weird situation.
Trailing by 20 in game 4, still better odds.
That's overstating it for sure. Yes. But it's more to lay the point here that there's been a problem with evaluating this team. Now, in other places, they're closer to 6 or 7 in terms of their implied odds for the championship. But when you get down into this level, basically they have to list all the teams. So the Nets are going to be somewhere on the list, right? But they're clearly not in the tier A of this group, because that group is really the Celtics, the Bucks, and the Warriors. And then there's a drop off, right? And that's who basically all markets see as the real contenders right now. And I think that makes sense. I think this team is just way too flawed. They have way too many problems. Forget even the inconsistency about who's going to be playing on a night-to-night basis. I think even when we factor that part in, even if we assume that everyone was good to go every night, which they're definitely not, even then I would have trouble. I'm taking their best version of them now and putting this not as a championship level team, right? And forget the question marks like Simmons' knee. I mean, I'm not going to label Kyrie a question mark here, but even when you factor those things in, I can't put them in the top group. There's just too many problems.
Yeah, there's 9 teams in the Western Conference that are plus in terms of point differential right now. Eastern Conference, including the Brooklyn Nets, you've got that upper echelon of teams, the top 6, and then it rounds out to 8 total. The Chicago Bulls narrowly above the mark there. It's take record away. And to your point about availability not being available, at some point, you have to just be what you are. And the plus 0.7 feels pretty much on the nose. This is a team that on a game-to-game basis, and by the way, record included, 500, that could go either way. And that can be 100% healthy, can be taking on a depleted or healthy team. And the one part that we haven't seen here that I think does lead to a little bit, at least, of a pessimistic initial outlook for this team, is that they've lost to the better teams they've played, and they haven't even played a ton of the better teams that are going to be coming up here on the schedule eventually, that I think would make this look even a little bit more grim here over the first 22.
Yeah, and look, and I think I want to be able to break the kind of section this off too as we go through this episode, to section off, if reevaluating the team as a championship contender is something we need to do, like, what does that actually mean for the team going forward?
Mhm.
Like, what does that mean for them, the trade deadline? What does that mean among the superstars? What does it mean looking forward to the future? I don't think it necessarily means blowing it up. Like, I think I'm able to be in sectioning these things off too in a way that I haven't been able to before.
Let's debate that.
Oh, interesting. We're going to get into all that here in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Sweatblock. Look, I've been in this situation before. You're up in front of crowds. I spent the better part of my pre-Locked On Nets life up in front of groups of people all the time teaching, right? And I would have to choose the outfit that was going to show the sweat the least. I've been through this. This is where Sweatblock comes in. Sweatblock completely solves this problem. You're not worried about what outfit you're choosing. You're not worried about just like being embarrassed if you got to, oh no, got to raise your hand in front of a group. God forbid. Sweatblock cures you from all of that worry. It gives you the confidence to wear what you want without the embarrassing sweat, kind of making it so that you just can't live your life in a normal way. Sweatblock wipes were featured and tested on the Rachel Ray Show by firefighters. Doesn't get any hotter than that, folks. A little hot under the collar. Go to the firefighters. If they're going for Sweatblock, then you should too. If you or someone you love is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, try Sweatblock. Save 20% with promo code LOCKED ON at sweatblock.com. Also available on Amazon.
Okay, so the next part of this evaluation, as you said, and I think it's important to try to compartmentalize, is what they put together coming into this season and where those expectations are, and whether or not you pose the question or you pose the statement, I'm not at a place where I think they should blow it up. The one thing interesting that coming into this was, and it just came out yesterday, the boardroom, you might know that as being the Kevin Durant created company, threw out a little tweet that effectively said a discarded piece from the Brooklyn Nets a year ago that could not seem to find a role is now serving a critical starting function on, wouldn't you know it, championship aspirational Milwaukee Bucks, and that's Javon Carter. And it turns out he's the exact thing that we talk about the Brooklyn Nets needing in their backcourt, a defensive-minded guard who can also shoot the ball respectively, can distribute, can facilitate, can run an offense. I think we just start there in terms of what they brought into this season before we talk about maybe what they should do coming up, heading towards the trade deadline. We always evaluate whether or not Sean Marks and the organization made good or bad decisions here. And unfortunately, even though we like the Yuta Watanabe, obviously, pickup, we like what they did bringing in Royce O'Neal. We talked last episode about, we like Royce, but it didn't mean you had to give up on Bruce Brown. And then you see a player like this. This is one of those things where the Toronto Raptors couldn't figure out the true value of Yuta Watanabe, maybe, but you had the guy in the building if you're the Brooklyn Nets. And Steve Nash, at least in that version of the coaching staff, seemingly could not envision a path where he had a high value to this roster.
So this is the other problem with this team. And Carter, while a minor piece, is endemic of sort of why I think we have this attitude about the Nets, is that while I think that we've been complimentary about the moves they made in this offseason, like you said, Royce, I've combined Yuta and Royce O'Neal to make it Ruda. O'Neal,
be a really nice player if you could merge them.
I think O'Neal has been a good pickup. Yuta Watanabe was clearly a good pickup. They're able to make these moves. The problem is when you are a championship team, you at that point, or if you have a championship aspirational team, at that point, you actually have very little margin for error on the mistakes you make around all the other moves, right? So while you can make good moves and still be a good team, to stay in the contention for the ultimate prize, right, of which only one team per year can win. And the Nets have not come close to that since the beginning of the Kevin Durant era. I mean, they were trending close, but in the end, they were still around 2 rounds away from actually getting there. Is that you actually can't make mistakes on these other marginal moves where the players would actually be really important, a la Javon Carter, a la Bruce Brown, a la like these guys that you had in the building that you could really, really use right now. And your team, it shows in your team. And it's these kind of marginal guys that are the reason I can't put them to the next level. We talked at length about Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is a championship cornerstone piece. You have that already. Kyrie Irving can be the second best player on a championship team. We've seen that already, right? Like Ben Simmons is a good enough talent to be on like in the discussion. If peak Ben Simmons is your third best player, you are, in the discussion now, right? Like this is where this team is created, but they just have made these other little mistakes around these other marginal plays, and then they're not able to actually make up the difference. Yeah. And so this is part of what we're seeing is the problem with this team is that while on an individual basis, I will say most moves that they've made are fine, right? It's when putting it all together, you start to realize that it just still remains flawed, sort of like across the board. They're missing a point attack defender. They're missing a stretch big, right? Like these things that are not foundational, but obvious, like obvious in what they need. And they year after year cannot seem to get it or keep it. And this is where you start to lose championships. This is where you leave the discussion, because once you can pick out one flaw and God forbid 2 flaws that are major with a team, you just can't put them in the discussion. And so while, is Javon Carter like some all NBA player that they let go? No, but it shows that there is continued sort of like misunderstanding about what they need. I'd put Jeff Green in this class too. Like letting Jeff Green, who is the perfect complementary piece to a Kyrie, KD, and James Harden team. Like literally perfect. You couldn't have constructed it any better. Small ball 5, could shoot the 3, could defend multiple positions. Like he was the dude. And they're like, we don't need it. We're going to sign Blake Griffin and James Johnson and guys like this. Like it's these mistakes that have really cost them over the last couple of years. And at some point, you just can't get it let off the hook anymore. Like Kevin Durant's only going to take you so far.
And, you choose to bring back Patty Mills. You let Bruce Brown walk. You let Jeff Green walk. You let Javon Carter go. And the real follow-up is also that, like, none of these guys went out and signed monster contracts that you couldn't have afforded to retain on your roster as well. The other piece I'll put in here, too, when we talk about the state of the roster, go back a previous draft class and remember, so you get Cam Thomas late in the first round. You also get Day'Ron Sharpe. You also get a Kessler Edwards second-round pick. We understand that. But the one thing I remember going back specifically with Cam Thomas, as soon as they draft him, you go, hey, microwave scorer, can give you more offense, all these things. But you can go back and reevaluate. Was that the best use of that draft pick? Is there a better Javon Carter type of guard that you could have brought in, whether through the draft or looking to other teams around the league and saying, do you want a Cam Thomas late in the first round who may be a falling star, and we can go get a veteran player from you in exchange for that asset? So the choices that Sean Marks as a GM has made, and we've talked about now, it feels like going back a number of years to say, hey, remember, he built you up to this point of attracting Kevin Durant. And we've also talked about this somewhat critically at times. Yes, now you have him. Do you understand the next step of that process once you have the superstar player? They seem to come and go here on hitting and missing. And maybe sometimes you mentioned the Jeff Green, even the Blake Griffin, by the way, who I was listening to John Corrales on Locked On Celtics talk about him as being a great glue locker room guy. Like at some point too, the back end of your roster, the Markieff Morris spot, it can still just get occupied by a Blake Griffin because he's already been there. And if they like him, whatever. So it's like sometimes changing this supporting cast for the sake of changing it, it's only a good thing if the results bear out that you made a better move. So far, you'd say Yuta, yes, that's been a hit. And we talked about Royce compared to Bruce Brown or the functionality of it. By and large, it kind of feels like musical chairs where you go, okay, now these 3 guys, now these 3 guys. And next year will be another 3 guys. Look around at some of the better teams in the league. Their supporting cast to whatever their talent level is, they usually maintain them year to year. So the superstars, your best players, have reliability and consistency around them.
Yeah, and look, can I kill Marks for not bringing Blake Griffin back? No,
No.
I don't think you're doing that. Like, but I do think you're saying like there is a lack of consistency from this team over the last couple of years. There's been massive overhaul and turnover just in terms of like what their personnel is. Really just over the last 4 years, the team is seemingly completely different year over year over year. Like that's maintained basically throughout the KD and Kyrie era. Like there's been almost no year-to-year consistency
It's
on.
throw it against the wall and see if it sticks, right? Like that's kind of what it feels like now in the third off-season version of this.
Yeah, exactly. And this is sort of the problem you run into when you push all your chips in for, a player or two, and you start to run out of options at that point.
And I have one follow-up on the young players on this roster before we turn our attention to what do Doug and I think, which I believe we'll disagree on, should happen here as they push towards that trade deadline.
All right, first going to tell you about the aforementioned betonline.net, your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. BetOnline, you get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. And there's a lot, folks. Just go to BetOnline and check it out. You're going to run through a list of sports and leagues that you didn't even know existed. Football to basketball to soccer to esports, they've got it all on betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. It's the fastest and easiest way to get in that betting fix. Head on over to the website today. Use that mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Okay. So one quick note on the young players that I mentioned there. Kessler Edwards can be put to the side. We highlighted his incredible G League performance the other night. But specifically with Daron Sharp and Cam Thomas and this past offseason, I can very easily look at the decisions that were made by the Nets organization and say, I understand what Patty Mills represents as a leader on this team. However, if he's not going to be playing for the most part, those minutes should automatically be going to Cam Thomas because there's some unknown upside. There's some undefined ceiling that this player can have for you and the impact he can have on your team. He's smaller. Okay, fine. He's not a perfect facilitator, but he does a lot of things a lot better than Patty Mills. The other guy is going to be Markieff Morris. If you're going to have him on this roster and he's not going to have a clearly defined role, even at a deep standpoint, then Daron Sharp should be the guy getting whatever minutes those are going to be. And if he's not good enough to get those minutes, then you've made a huge mistake when you drafted him or even having him up out of the G League at this point.
Well, what about the scenario where none of them play? Because that's where they are now. It's like none of these guys play.
So to further the point is, so if it's not going to be Cam Thomas and Daron Sharp, then whoever you brought in, whether it's bringing back Patty, bringing in Markieff, any of these players, they better have an effing role. Because otherwise, why did you go out and waste even the marginal money on them? And that's kind of my point. If no one's playing, then why are they there? Give me one other player that you pick up in the offseason that has a clear defined role. Again, we use the Yuta Watanabe as the measuring stick because he's had a role and been successful at it, even if we think it's going to regress back to the mean. Find me one other player that functions. And by the way, Sean Marks has been good at this. Going back to the Spencer Dinwiddies, right? Going back to the Joe Harrises of the world. Go find that one guy and bring him in and know that he represents consistent 15 minutes a night. Because right now I have 4 or 5 guys on the roster, none of which I would earmark for 3 minutes, let alone saying that they could play 15. So that's a big issue that I have around the decision-making that you have this offseason. You have young players, either commit to them or know that you can't. And then the choices you make off that need to be a little bit clear before we talk about what we think they should do.
Yeah, I generally agree. Look, I mean, TJ Warren maybe comes back. We change our assessment. Maybe Edmund Sumner starts getting more minutes and we change our assessment. It's hard to see Mills working his way back into the rotation at this point, short of an injury, and that contract's going to look particularly brutal going into next season because they have him on the books for another year. Go ahead, and then we'll talk about how we just viewed this going forward.
Yeah, and just quickly, you mentioned Sumner, who obviously had question marks coming back from an injury, but he's the perfect example of this is why you shouldn't be bringing back Patty Mills. You brought in a guy, it's a flyer, and Cam Thomas is the stopgap, or he's just what it is, whatever the case may be, or DDJ, even if it's not perfect, good, bad, indifferent. It's just live with what you have and then take the risk on the new piece you're bringing in. But instead, you're playing this cat and mouse game of, is Edmund Sumner functioning enough? Do you want to use him? Maybe he isn't good enough to play consistently, but you keep doing this back and forth thing, which leads to problems, at least for me, when I'm evaluating this team. The deadline is going to come. The Brooklyn Nets. So here's where I know we 100% agree. I would not trade Kevin Durant this season, no matter what. You have him under contract for 2 more years. He's still going to be a guy that gives you these performances. So you want to, whatever, sell tickets. You want to entertain your fan base. There's no reason to give him up at any point. You can tell me there's a package that comes across the table that convinces me. But as we saw this offseason, it didn't look like it was ever going to get there. The other players, though, specifically Kyrie Irving, I have no problem with moving on from him at the deadline. So you want to call it the partial blow up or the mini blow up or the tweak, whatever it is. He's coming in his last year of his contract. We know he's on the opt-in. I don't see him returning to this team. You know what he is on the court. That's never been debated. And while teams may have questions around his commitment to basketball 1,000% or just being available for it, I actually do think the latest instance with him has brought him back to the point where he knows off season combined with the start of this season, I need to put the best foot forward. Now, we had that discussion coming into the year, and he still had a bit of an issue, but that was, while bad, it wasn't something that seemed predestined to occur, right? Which sometimes you can see them coming with Kyrie. You can get value for him. I don't know what the team is going to be or what the market's going to be, but something is better than nothing. And I think you have to consider that if we agree that this team is mediocre at best.
Yeah, this is really, really tough. I probably disagree because I just think if the goal is to keep Kevin Durant, then you probably just have to see the Kyrie thing out and just see what happens. Like, and I only because I just think the trade value is probably so low at this point. There's probably one or two teams that would even be bothered to take a flyer on him. And I'm just not sure you get.
But what is this seeing it out for you though? Is it bringing him back after this year?
Yeah. So okay. So this is where I'm at a little bit of a crossroads because I actually don't know if I have a great idea. I typically subscribe to championship or bust. Like that is like the mentality. I think that's the reason when you're at this stage, especially when you get a Kevin Durant, that you really at that point you have to be championship or bust. And like most of your organizational philosophy should be around trying to acquire a player like this at some point on the timeline, right? Like that's the whole thing. You can, and to not do that is to be like sort of in the NBA wilderness at times, right? Like it's just to, you know, I'm trying to think of, I mean, there's many examples like this. Like, you know, if Bradley Beal is your best, most highest paid player, the team has a ceiling, right? The Wizards have a clear ceiling of what they can be. They can be fun. They can be an attractive team. Maybe they make the playoffs, have a nice, like win a playoff round. That's going to be kind of it. Now that might be good enough. Like that might be from a fan perspective, fine. Right. Like it just
be competitive, be in the playoffs every year.
Be competitive and be in the playoffs. It does. I feel like it changes a little bit when you have Kevin Durant in the building because he is among that class of player that you kind of need to win a championship. So once you actually have that guy, you kind of do need to be on the championship hierarchy because you just happen to have one of these top 6 guys in the league or whatever that can actually make it all the way. Mm-hmm. I do think though, I'm torn now because I actually see the Nets as not having tons of great outs here. And at that point, remaining sort of just like disappointingly competitive might be the path because I don't think you're improving your team by trading Kyrie like at all. And just because I don't think you'll get anything close.
I'll push back on that a little bit.
I don't think you're getting close to fair value on it. I think you'll never be able to trade Simmons at this point. Like, especially even if when he was turning the corner, just the injury thing is too risky. Mm-hmm. And so I just think you're at this weird place where you have to see it out. And I think for me personally, you just have to see it out with a mind toward not feeling disappointed if the championship isn't the thing. And that's a weird place. Like I haven't really been there for myself on this because I just don't really want to be in this mode, right? Like this is not as fun of a mode because like you don't want to look at the Nets as like this scrappy upstart team that can maybe win a playoff round because they have Kevin Durant. Like that changes the whole conversation. But at this point, things that I think will be hard for them to do. I don't think they're going to be able to just mysteriously bring in a stretch 5 that's going to be like a game changer. They don't have the pieces. They just don't. Like
the Joe Harris for Miles Turner straight up doesn't work for you.
These guys are like at all-time low trade value. Like you're not bringing these guys in. They're really short on draft picks. Just because they're the Harden trade, they just don't have a ton of assets. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe you can get some kind of like guard point of attack defender that can change your fortunes a little bit. I think that will be hard too. I just think all of it's going to be hard. And I know this sounds super defeatist. It's actually not. I think it's more.
It's just recalibrating the expectation.
It's a recalibration. Yep. Yes, it's a recalibration of expectation to not look at these championship odds and be like, they're top 5, man. Let's get it. Like I just don't think that's realistic. I just don't think it's realistic. But I also don't think blowing it up is realistic either. They are in a very, very historically weird spot right now. They have made some macro moves that have not worked out to such a high level that they're just kind of pot stuck. And I just don't see a way out. So at that point, I'm like, hey, man, let's just roll game by game and see how this goes.
Lean into
I just don't know another mentality to take it.
Yeah. So the couple of things are, one, hey, listen, you get to the playoffs, even as a mediocre average team, and you have Kevin Durant and you have Kyrie Irving, hey, they can take over a game for you. Now, so far this season, you'd say Kevin Durant has to take over a game to beat the Orlando Magic. So it's not necessarily a glowing prospect, but that at least exists. The possibility of what does 7 games look like when you have one of the best players in the game. One of my concerns around maybe not pulling the trigger on a Kyrie Irving trade towards the deadline is the other side of it, which is, we may be saying, all right, we're going to kind of live in this. You're a playoff team, but the championship is off the table. The Nets organization isn't thinking that way if they stay with this model, at which point, like, you start to look at, and I know maybe fans don't care, and you sacrifice this guy to get whoever it takes, whatever. Losing Nicholas Claxton in a move because you have Ben Simmons and this version of the team and you're going for it to bring in stretch X or player Y, whatever it may be, like in the old 2 years from now, he's the exact kind of exciting young player you want to be a part of what you're doing going forward. And I know that you can get another one of those players, and maybe he's not a unicorn. You mentioned the other day, he's clearly a starting center in the NBA. Fans just need to accept that. And I think that that's a little bit of the difficult part. You don't have a lot of capital, so you're going to start stripping some of these other fringe assets to try to throw it in for one more dip. That ultimately, I don't think you're going to make any significant moves that are going to change it. And even if you go and you sacrifice the limited draft capital you do have to go, quote, all in for the remainder of this year, you said it, I still don't think that there's the move that gets you there, at which point all you're doing is further damaging your long-term prospects around something that's never going to be the ultimate goal. I'm okay with being a playoff team that has Kevin Durant. You win a lot of games. You're a 45-win team, every year for the next 2.5 seasons, and you live with whatever those results may be, great. But at some point, accepting that the version you thought was going to work is not going to work, do something different, right? And it's not, this isn't even it's not a knock on Kyrie Irving. It's not a referendum on who he is as a person or as a player. It's just saying, guess what? If you told me next year it was Kevin Durant, probably with Ben Simmons and a couple of other players that are never going to equal Kyrie Irving, but maybe make a better, more balanced team that's still just a 45-win team and still goes to the playoffs with question mark next to what the result would be, I think that that's worth it for the change, for the difference. Because again, I don't think, or I'll say this, I don't want it to be the Kyrie Irving back on another extension with Kevin Durant, because that version of this team is not winning a championship this year or in the final 2 years of KD's contract.
Yeah, and I really don't think that's going to happen anyway. I
Right.
don't think they're going to extend them, I don't think they're going to re-sign them. I don't.
So anything is better than nothing at this point, then.
Yeah, and if you think that is going to be the case, and a sign and trade is going to be problematic too because of his whatever perceived value, then yeah, maybe it is easy to see that. And maybe if there is a market for it, maybe we go that direction too. I don't know. I think some of this will be fleshed out. Again, when we get closer to the trade deadline, we'll probably have a new view of what's happening here. I don't think.
If 4 games under, 5 games over makes a big difference.
I'd be shocked if my view, short of just like some crazy, amazing run that lasted like 10 games, that was just them just blitzing teams. I don't think my championship feeling is going to change. It's definitely not going to change on a game-to-game basis. If they went out and beat 2 good teams by 30 the next 2 days for whatever reason, I know that's not the Wizards, but like whatever along this timeline, I actually don't think my feeling about it is not going to change in the macro, I don't think.
And maybe in the worst way we'll get out the door is that essentially from where you and I stood in the offseason coming into this year, 22 games in, 500, I don't think that we've really moved. We haven't been moved by what we've seen from the team, for better or worse. And that may be the most damning commentary about it. It's like, you don't feel any different. You don't feel any better about it. And if anything, at best, you feel mildly worse. And that's not what you wanted to see here 22 games in.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's where we are. So at the 27.5% mark, that is where we stand with the Brooklyn Nets. Make sure you subscribed over on YouTube. We're climbing. We're going to try to get to 4,000 subscribers over here. We're on the march toward that number. Be part of it. Hit subscribe. We'll be here after the game on Wednesday against the Wizards, live after the game. So go and jump on that. You'll get the notification for it after you subscribe over at Locked On Nets YouTube.
You stop being average the day you decide to become a champion, because the average person won't make that decision. Tommy Hopkins.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.